Failure by design. Why what we are doing in corporate crisis management isn't working, and what submarines, forest fires, and the 16th century English Navy can teach us. By Jason Boyevich, Principal and Co-founder, ICRA Creative Group. I'm going to start with a confession. I own a Toyota. Now, that one, specifically. I won it 2 years ago from the Minnesota Public Radio Listener Contest. I guess I am living proof someone wins those things. But in all the time I've had it, it's never, ever, once accelerated without me. Unfortunately, that's more than we can say for several Toyota models. 8 of Toyota's top brands all share the same steering pedal engineering problem. Perhaps worse, the new Prius doesn't want to stop. I guess Mr. Toyota is lucky ritual suicide is no longer required of executives in these situations. But needless to say, Toyota has what we might call a problem. And just when you thought everything would be fine if you just waited it out for a few months, here's the rub. It probably won't. Mattel never recovered after its little lead paint issue in 2007. Now, if you run an organization, this sort of thing's going to keep you up at night. If you're one of the rest of us, we wonder why these things just seem to keep happening. Now, let's try to answer that question. And let's start where most corporate managers start, once the crisis has happened. I lovingly sum up the reaction with the 3 Ds. Delay admitting there's a problem, deny there's any problem at all, or finally, try to dismiss the seriousness of the problem. But intuitively, we know there is a better way. As communication professionals, we relearn what everyone else learned in kindergarten about how to react when you do bad. Admit your mistake quickly, say you're sorry, and take action to fix it. It really isn't that hard, but understand this. The combination of big ego lawyers and big ego CEOs is not a prescription for openness. Speaking of CEOs of big egos, Mr. GE summed up typical crisis this way. We all want to deny it at first, we'll all try to contain it, we want someone to take the fall, we'd love to see a head roll or two, then everything's going to be fine. That's just the way it works. Crisis is inevitable. Well, I might add, crisis is worse than inevitable. Crises are cyclical. Like the issues management chart I'm showing here, much like a bad house guest, crisis issues never go away. They just hide under the bed. All it takes is the smallest of sparks to reignite the problem, which puts management in a bit of an unpredictable pickle. If you're a brand manager for Tylenol, things worked out okay. People aren't thinking they're going to drop dead the next time they take an extra strength caplet. But if you work for Chi-Chi's, a few bad green onions meant you were out looking for work. Now, for us in the communication business, otherwise known as the crisis cleanup crew, we resign ourselves to a certain sense of fatalism. We can't really prevent a crisis, we can only make the best of it once it happens. Sometimes we get lucky, we just have to pay the piper. Sometimes we're not so lucky, and our company never really recovers. But, wait a second, what if crisis was not inevitable? Or perhaps, what about if we thought about it a different way? What if we could prepare ourselves structurally to dramatically mitigate the damage and prevent a small problem from getting completely and totally out of hand and spiraling into a full-fledged crisis? Let's look at a few ways where we might do that. I once had a friend who served on a sub in the U.S. Navy. I remember him telling me sub design was actually pretty simple. It's not a pleasure boat. It's a combat vessel. It's going to take a hit. And if it does, and if the whole thing floods, you're underwater, you don't have gills, and you're screwed. That's why subs are designed with bulkheads. Well, what can we learn from submarine engineers? Pretty simple, really. What if we isolated our brands and services from each other? If you had a bad experience at Red Lobster, do you stop going to the Olive Garden? Do you know they're owned by the same firm? Do you know that about Tide and Crest? Most people don't, and that is absolutely the idea. But you know, we get conflicting advice. It's the old argument about centralization versus decentralization. Over the last 20 years in communication strategy, we know what point of view has gained the upper hand. In the run for efficiency, we have, in my view, dangerously centralized our risk. Maybe folk wisdom was right. Maybe we need more than one basket. So next, what if we learn to think like a forest ranger? Well, there's one inevitability in the forest. They burn. If they haven't burned in a while, a buildup of dry brush will lead to a catastrophic wildfire. That's okay, I guess, if you don't happen to live nearby. But every forest manager knows if you can burn off a little bit of that dry undergrowth in a controlled way, you might avoid the big one. It seems like our friends at 3M have hired a group of forest rangers to run their communication efforts. That's a compliment. They're out in public almost all the time with some bit of bad news. Yeah, there's some squawking, especially if you live in Woodbury or Lake Elmo, but it never rises to the point where it engulfs the company. 3M just seems to have an innate sense that you'd prefer to make a lot of little stinks than one big stink. Because, just like the poor little skunk, if you make yourself known for big stinks, people have trouble associating you with anything else. They just remember that you stink. Now, for our last lesson, let's take a trip back in time to 1588 in the seemingly invincible Spanish Armada. The English didn't try to be as big or as strong or as dominant as the Spanish fleet. They didn't try to be the king of the mountain. They just tried to be smaller, faster, and better. The rest, shall we say, is history. Now, we can see this lesson play out even today. There is a point in its corporate history when Honda could have made a run at Toyota as the biggest Japanese, really the biggest world's automaker, but it didn't. It strategically chose to be the second place finisher. That's what's so hard for us in the United States to do, to finish second. It just doesn't feel right. We do not like silver medal. But I'm going to lay a little Zen truth on you, something you already know. Not everyone can be number one. Top of the mountain might just have the best view, but it's also the easiest place to get struck by lightning. Now, really, it all comes down to this. We need to apply what I would call a little bit more engineering thinking to how we approach crisis management, to restructure and rethink the inevitability of crisis situations. Is every lesson here appropriate for every organization? No, of course not. But unless we think differently, we'll never hope to break the cycle. Thanks for listening. For more information or to schedule an interview, contact Jason Boyevich at US 651-209-2778 or jason@equicreative.com. Don't forget to read State of the Brand each week at stateofthebrand.com.